Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more interesting stories like these. Now, let's get into today's story video. My 29 male, ex-fiancé, 29 female, cheated on me 4 years ago. I picked myself up and came back stronger than ever. Part 2. After many rounds of interviews with several companies, I was given a job at the New York office of a well-known private equity firm. After I inquired about working in the London office instead of the New York office, the managing director put me in touch with his counterpart in London. An offer for a job at the London office was made to me after 2 interviews, and I accepted it. I was thrilled at the time. Someone who successfully converts from investment banking to private equity is considered a great accomplishment by people who are not in the financial industry. As a way of celebrating my accomplishments, I had a little get-together at my flat after the conclusion of my first day at the new fund. Antoine had just made the jump to private equity, and his so worked at the fund I had recently joined, as well as another friend, came at the office. I encouraged Alyssa to come along with us, and she happily accepted my invitation. She was the last to come, but when she arrived, she greeted me with a kiss and an embrace and expressed her delight in my accomplishments. I closed my eyes and held her for a second longer, savoring the sensation of holding her. We were gathered around the island in my kitchen, talking, laughing, and generally having a good time. Jane had just recently returned from a trip. It was 1 a.m. at the time. She could have had a busy day at work, but had most likely just finished sleeping with AP. We glanced at the entrance to see who had just stepped in, but we couldn't place her since we didn't recognize her. Everyone at the table knew precisely what was going on. When Jane returned, Alyssa had her hand over my shoulder, but she didn't remove her hand away from my shoulder. Rather of allowing Jane's presence to interfere from our joyful feelings, we just carried on our conversation. Jane tried to sit between me and Alyssa, in an uncomfortable manner, to say the least, but ended up on the other side of the table from me. We continued on with our conversation as if Jane wasn't there. I also didn't pay attention to her, keeping my body oriented towards Alyssa the whole time. Jane seemed to be in a great deal of discomfort, and I could tell. Everyone agreed to depart at 2 p.m. in order to return home and sleep. I opened the door and walked out with everyone before putting on my shoes and followed after them. Jane asked as to my whereabouts, her voice tinged with concern in her tone of speech. I closed the door behind me before she could respond. "I'll be back in a minute," I replied. When I awoke at 8 a.m., Alyssa was still sleeping next to me, so I kissed her on the cheek and went home to carry out the last part of my new plan. I had turned off my phone before going to bed since it was inundated with text messages and phone calls from Jane. Jane was sitting on the island looking sad when I arrived home, her eyes and nose red from weeping. My heart would have crushed for her if this had happened before she betrayed me, and I would have done everything to cheer her up. But after what she'd done, I felt nothing, not even pity. "What were you doing?" she inquired. "I fell asleep in the vehicle." I said I didn't own a car, but I didn't care if my replies were illegible at the time. Must clean up and go to work. I then entered the shower. I got out and put on my suit, realizing that she needed to be at peace before leaving for work, and she couldn't be at home if my plan was to succeed. I exited the room fully clothed, approached Jane, and softly put my palm on her face. "Look," I said softly, staring into her eyes, "I have to go to work now, but I promise I'll come home earlier today to speak about this, okay?" I then softly kissed her forehead and told her I loved her. That was the only fake sincere kiss I ever gave her, and I was relieved that I wouldn't have to do it again. The last element of my new plan was to move out and ghost her, but instead of going to New York, I would be moving into a new and significantly more luxury flat in an affluent neighborhood in the city center that I had acquired the previous week. I had taken a day off from work to relocate since weekdays were when Jane was gone from home the longest and most consistently. I had breakfast with Owen and Antoine at a neighboring eatery. They too had taken a day to help me out. When we were finished, I checked her position on my phone, and she was indeed at work. We returned to my previous apartment, loaded all of my belongings that I hadn't transferred to Owen's place into his vehicle, and drove away. I was sorry to leave the apartment I had called home for the previous 3 years, but this was a fresh beginning, and change isn't always easy. The former flat's lease was in my name, and it was set to expire in 2 months, but with my new wage, 2 months' rent at the previous place was nothing. Besides, paying 2 months' rent to see my traitorous fiancé's life fall apart was a steal. Life was fantastic when I moved out. My new work was fantastic, and I was having a great time. I suddenly had a lot more spare time. I resumed boxing on a regular basis and was able to sleep at night. My friends claimed I looked better and happier, and I agreed. Alyssa and I made our relationship official, and we were quite happy together. She even got an opportunity to join a separate private equity firm right out of school, which is quite an accomplishment. I can honestly say that I was happier than I had been since graduating from high school. Jane, on the other hand, took my absence like an uppercut to the chin from which she could not recover for a long time. At one point, she hounded all of my pals with texts and phone calls inquiring about me. I had prohibited her from using my phone, social media, and so on. She still had the engagement ring I gave her, but asking for it back wouldn't have given me much of an advantage. I never found out about her connection with AP, nor did I care what happened to them. He could have her if he wanted to. Trash is usually piled together in a heap. After a morning meeting, I was coming back to my desk when I was confronted by an unwelcome visitor, an enraged Jane standing between me and my cubicle. She came forward and began hitting me, streams of expletives and fury erupting from her lips as she attempted to smack me across the face, but I easily dodged her blows. Chiara, my cubicle companion, and another coworker quickly restrained her. I was so concerned, she sobbed as she sank to her knees. "I'd missed you. Where have you gone? I adore you. How could you do such a thing to me?" I casually got out my phone, played the footage of her and AP getting it on, and shoved it in her face. When I think about it now, I still find myself chuckling at the expression of dread on her face. She began to hyperventilate. "Look," she murmured, her breathing hard. "I can explain. It's not what it seems to be." I couldn't help but giggle when I saw the timeline. It's not what it seems to be. It was obvious that she was being ed by someone other than her fiancé. I wanted to shout at her and slap her in the face for all she'd done to me. But in fact, it would come off as me attempting to persuade her that she had done something heinous. She knew she'd have ed up big time, and the guilt was already devouring her. "Op, take a look at me," she said quietly. "I love you, and I will always love you, as long as the sky is blue. The sky is constantly gloomy in London." I replied with a straight face and a smug tone. Chiara stifled a chuckle by covering her lips with her palm. Jane's continued unabated when security intervened and led her out of the office. A little more than an hour later, Jane got yet another dose of karma. I had made plans to meet up with Alyssa for lunch. The moment I walked through the door, my building's lobby, she was waiting for me. We kissed and then walked hand in hand towards the exit, right into Jane's perplexed gaze. We kissed again. During a particularly unpleasant time, we were all gazing at each other. Jane then collapsed on her knees, again, and sobbed uncontrollably. Most likely, she was merely jealous that I'd abandoned her for someone far more attractive, or she may have been filled with guilt and grief. I'd never find out, and to be honest, I couldn't care less. We just moved around her and out into the open to avoid her. The rest of Jane's story centers on her engagement and her relationships with her friends and family, but that's a story for another day. For the time being, life is still good for me. I was elevated to VP, Vice President, at my fund only a few weeks ago, and I'm on track to become a partner by the time I turn 40, hopefully. As of right now, Alyssa is my new fiancé. I proposed to her last summer, and she accepted with tears in her eyes. We are madly in love with each other. We want to be married as soon as the pandemic is over, and we're already talking about starting a family together. Despite the fact that the new lockdown is horrible for everyone, we are tremendously lucky in that we have each other to depend on during such trying times. That brings my story to a close, ladies and gentlemen. For the sake of illustration, if you have been the victim of infidelity, it is not the end of the world. You can always bounce back, level up, and reach new heights you never imagined were possible. Everyone has a beautiful day ahead of them.